My name is Admati, and I am the founder and faculty director of the Corporation Society Initiative, CASI, here at Stanford Graduate School of Business. CASI engages on issues in the intersection of business, government, and society. We focus on issues that are often overlooked and avoided, including power and information imbalances, conflicts of interest. We aim to promote effective governance where those with power are properly accountable when using their power to impact other people. Tonight, we're thrilled to have with us Naomi Oreskes for a rich discussion on business role in driving free market narratives. Naomi is an award-winning and world-renowned scientist, historian, and author. She's a professor of history and science at Harvard University. I first met Naomi after she wrote her first book, Merchants of Doubt. Co-author is Eric Conway, who's also the co-author of the book we're discussing today, which exposed how a small group of scientists hid factual truths on the health effects of tobacco and the threats of warming climate. These actions have long-lasting and adverse effect on public knowledge and understanding of these issues. Of course, Naomi and I were both headed to Davos in January 2014, and again in 2015, and what united us is that both of us discovered the subtle power of deception for profit and control over narratives, particularly in situations where the public can be easily confused, such as in banking, because the issues are technical, or because they just don't know enough about it, like in climate change at the time. Of course, by now we do know that climate change is real and that humans had something to do with it, and we're facing that challenge, which is difficult. This new book, The Big Myth, that we're discussing today, is, the authors say in the preface, a prequel to the other book, meaning that they dug farther back in the history of corporate narratives in this country and discovered the role of their narrative that undermined the role of government and democracy while telling the story of supposedly free market. Something came up in a previous event here where our speaker said no rules, no markets, and the market and government intervening in markets is just like the NBA intervening in basketball game to set the rules. Anyway, I just learned actually that there is a word for what Naomi and I encountered, and I will share you a new word that you learned today. It's called agnotology. And there's a conference here that she's here for tomorrow and Saturday, the new science of creating and preventing ignorance. If you look up in Google, you will find that agnotology is following. Within the sociology of knowledge, and agnotology is the study of deliberate, culturally induced ignorance or doubt, typically to sell a product, influence opinion, win favor, particularly through the publication of inaccurate or misleading scientific data, parentheses, disinformation. So we know that's a big problem. Now, I'm going to let the conversation go, and who we have to moderate it is one of our departing, I'm sad to say, leaders of the CASI initiative, Louise White. And we will miss her greatly, but we have a new crop of student leaders who are taking over. I believe Amira is here, right in front of me, taking care of the Zoom. And these are the first years who are going to take over. She's among that group because CASI is powered by student energy a lot. And we have a director, Lisa, and a project director, Loretta, who made this event possible. So without further ado, I'm going to let Louise take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anat. Welcome. Great to see you all tonight. We are thrilled to have you both, for those in the room and then for those on Zoom. Really excited you all are here to dive into a great conversation. I'm going to start with a couple initial questions, but then we'll turn it to y'all, and excited to hear what questions you have for Naomi. So please get your questions ready. And for folks on Zoom, if you put them in the chat, Amira can help convey that to the room. All right, so let's dive in. So I want to start with kind of laying some of the groundwork on the key finding and themes from the book, and then we'll kind of move into bringing the conversation to the present and thinking about how history is showing up for us today and what we can do about it going forward. But to lay the groundwork, would love to hear, what is the big myth and why should we care about it?
Great question. So we characterize the big myth as really having three parts. So the first part is the idea of the free market, the idea that there even is such a thing as the free market that exists unto itself, separate from human institutions and agency, as opposed to markets being a human institution, being a tool that people develop, and as Anat just said, of course markets have rules because we create them, so we decide what the rules are by which those markets should operate. The second part of the myth is the idea that markets have wisdom, that if you leave markets alone, then the invisible hand of the marketplace will solve our problems, and therefore that government should get out of the way, lest government distort the marketplace. And then the third part of the myth, and I think this is the part, excuse me, that's less well known and less well understood, but what we show in the book is that throughout the 20th century, and particularly from the mid-century onward, that market fundamentalists or market essentialists, whatever word you like for them, pushed forward the idea not just that markets are an efficient means to deliver goods and services, but that they're a bulwark of freedom, that economic freedom protects political freedom, and if you compromise economic freedom, you're on a slippery slope to totalitarianism. And that, in a way, I think is the most noxious part of the whole. Well, there's a lot of things that are noxious about this, but it's particularly noxious because, we can argue about how efficient markets are or are not. We can argue about what the rules for markets should be, how strict they should be or not. But this third part of the myth is just a complete falsehood, a complete misrepresentation of the facts of history.
And could you kind of share a little bit more about how did we get to that point? And what were those critical moments? You cover in the book nearly 100 years of times when businesses were putting forward pretty aggressive campaigns to put this free market as a core part of our ideology. Can you share just a couple of those key moments of really when it took root?
And this is why, if I look exhausted, I am. I do not recommend writing a book that covers 120 years of history, and it was not our intention. I have to say, honestly, naively, when we first started this book, we thought it would start with Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was the person who really first started aggressively arguing government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem, and really tried to turn the American people against government and to make us hate what he called big government. But we quickly learned that Reagan is not where this began. He's the person who brought it into mainstream politics, but as we started digging, the story went back further and further and further, and eventually we settled on a place to start, which was debates over child labor in the early 20th century. And when we landed on this debate, it was really interesting for two reasons. One was because this is where we found the origins of this argument. Progressive era reformers were fighting against child labor, saying that this was a bad thing, a kind of self-evidently bad thing, that children as young as 2 years old were working in textile mills in Massachusetts, in factories and mines around the country, and that children should be in school so that they could have the opportunity to become educated and be full citizens of the Republic. The business community began to argue against that, not by saying that child labor was great, because that would obviously not be plausible, but by beginning to construct an argument about freedom, by saying, well, if you let the government tell business people what to do, that's an encroachment on the freedom of business people to run their, I'm going to say businessmen, because they were men, to run their businesses as they see fit, and an encroachment on the freedom of fathers to decide on how their children should, move through the world. So we decided that was a good place to start the story, because it was the first place where we begin to see that argument being made, but also because we naively thought that no one would possibly think that child labor was a good idea. And there's even a place in the book where we quote from a famous Supreme Court decision where Oliver Wendell Holmes says, if there's anything that civilized people agree on, it's the evil of child labor. And yet here we are 120 years later, and we see certain people in our society trying to bring back child labor.
So it started with the kind of child labor laws, and then what were kind of the key points that?
So in the 1920s, there's a big debate over electricity markets. And this is a really important early example of market failure. People recognize that the model of electricity that has developed in the United States, which is mostly based on the notion of a regulated natural monopoly, but with private sector operation, is failing rural Americans. The private sector model has done a good job bringing electricity to urban residents, but not to rural Americans because, and GE said this explicitly, the rural customer doesn't have enough money to be a profitable customer. And so they simply abandon those markets. But a lot of people say, well, hold on, that's not fair. People need electricity. Electricity isn't just something discretionary, it's something you really need. And so in Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania, Gifford Pinchot, progressive Republican, friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, proposes a program for the state of Pennsylvania to not to nationalize the electricity industry, but to create an electricity pool that would guarantee access to all Pennsylvanians. And for this, he's massively attacked by the electricity industry, who begin to launch a massive propaganda campaign to persuade the American people that this is a threat to the American way of life, this is creeping communism, there's a lot of red baiting. He gets accused of being a socialist, even though he definitely is not. And they launch a textbook campaign to rewrite the textbooks that are being written in that are being used in American high schools and colleges, and also to influence the curricula in burgeoning business schools to be pro-market, pro-capitalist, anti-regulation, and anti-government. And so very early on, we see the seeds of this, government is bad, regulation is bad. And then that gets carried forward during the New Deal. So the Great Depression hits. The electricity issue had been widely recognized as a market failure, but now you have the Great Depression, where the whole economy is collapsing, and capitalism appears to many people to be in free fall. And the business community is saying, oh, don't worry, we'll fix it, it's all be fine. But that doesn't seem very credible to the American people, and so Herbert Hoover loses the election for the presidency in 1932, FDR is elected, and as we all know, begins a whole set of reforms that engage the federal government much more actively in managing the American economy, and also passes a whole set of rules to protect labor, such as Social Security, minimum wage, and finally, 30 years later, to ban child labor. Not even to ban it, but to greatly restrict it. So a group of businessmen under the umbrella of the National Association of Manufacturers, who at the time are the largest trade organization in the United States, launch a second wave of propaganda modeled consciously on the electricity industry's first wave through film, television, radio, to propagandize free market ideology, that the New Deal is socialistic, that it's anti-American, and that it threatens your freedom. And so here we really see this. And they launch a campaign which they call the tripod of freedom. And the argument they make, and here's where we begin to see the overt misrepresentation of American history. So they make the claim that America as a nation was founded on three essential principles that are like a tripod, and if you undermine any leg of the tripod, the whole structure will collapse. So what are these three legs? Representative democracy, the Bill of Rights, and free enterprise capitalism. Now, that's not true. Right? Free enterprise capitalism is not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Bill of Rights. And in fact, if you know anything about Alexander Hamilton, you know that many of the founding fathers were big advocates of government engagement, and the 19th century was characterized massively by protective tariffs. And in fact, fun irony of the story, of which there are many, the National Association of Manufacturers, who is now putting forward this tripod of freedom idea, actually was created in the 19th century to argue for protective tariffs for fledgling industries in the United States. So that's a pretty key moment. And then we carry it forward through business funding of the Chicago School of Economics, the recruitment of Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, founders of Austrian economics, to come to the United States, the promotion of their work through Reader's Digest, through cartoons, literal cartoons, film, television, the Little House on the Prairie series. There's so much stuff that I'm having trouble just giving you a few highlights. Little House on the Prairie is definitely a highlight. And then we show how this gets carried forward by Ronald Reagan through his work with the General Electric Corporation, and then by Reagan as a candidate who then brings it into mainstream politics.
That's the tripod of freedom piece. I think one that really struck out to me. I was actually just going to read a quick quote that I wrote down that was that economic freedom was now not merely one leg of a tripod, but it became the flagpole on which the flag of freedom flew. Put another way, the ambition was for Americans to understand freedom in singularly economic terms, where it sounds like that kind of tripod started to shift into the flagpole, into becoming the one.
So what we see in this evolution of this narrative is, first it's the construction of economic freedom as something that is as essential to American life as, say, freedom of religion or freedom of speech. But then it gets prioritized that much more to the claim that economic freedom is actually the paramount freedom, because if you compromise that, then everything else fails. And that's the argument we see being carried forward by Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics.
And I think one other piece that I was struck by towards the end, that I think I've had several conversations with classmates here, that we are frustrated with how our form of capitalism exists today. But there's no clear path forward on what is the alternative, socialism, being one, or capitalism. It's like you're posed with these like two options, and it feels like there's not much discussion around what other forms can be. And you mentioned that that how this like free markets narrative and how kind of core that has become to a lot of how we think about the economy has really blinded us to other options of different forms of capitalism. Could you speak more to that of how do we kind of get to such a polarized kind of view of the world, and then where would you like to see the conversation unfold, and like what other alternatives or kind of where's the middle ground that we can be moving towards?
Well, I'd say one of the key goals that Eric Conway and I have for this book is to try to open up space for a conversation on exactly that point. We don't propose to have the solution, and we knew that if we tried, then people would just argue about the last 10 pages of the book, which already is happening to some degree. But it would be a different book to try to address that. But one thing that, well, a couple of things I would say. Part of the whole way that this narrative operated was to set up a false dichotomy, that the only choices we have are unregulated capitalism on the one hand with economic freedom paramount, or we're living under Soviet-style, centrally planned economy, totalitarianism. And that argument was really based on the sort of privileging and prioritizing of an argument that came out of the Austrian School of Economics. So if we go back to the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, Ludwig von Mises, who's considered one of the founders of the Austrian school, developed a critique of Soviet-style centralized planning. And like a lot of arguments that go wrong, it starts with some important and legitimate points. So one of the things that Mises and some of the Austrians argue is that markets are really good sources of information. And this is an argument you'll still see today, and it's an argument that I think most of us would agree with. And he says, so one of the problems with the planned economy is if you don't have markets, the government doesn't have the information it needs in order to figure out what people need or how many tractors we should be manufacturing. And so I think so far so good. But then he says, and then necessarily the government will begin to become coercive, because lacking that information, the government has to make decisions about who's going to work where and what factory will, and this is what then begins to happen in the Soviet Union under centralized planning. And then he says, so any kind of centralized planning is going to be necessarily devolve into a totalitarian state, which might, even up to that point, I might agree with. But then there's one more piece. And this is the piece then that Friedrich von Hayek picks up on and becomes famous for in his 1944 Road to Serfdom. Therefore, any government action in the marketplace potentially risks putting us on the road to serfdom. And so Hayek, for example, famously opposes the National Health Program in the United Kingdom, saying, well, socialized medicine, government intervention in the marketplace, we're on the road to serfdom. And that's where it seems to me what begins as a legitimate critique of centralized planning then goes down into its own kind of slippery slope logic, right? And so therefore, both Mises and Hayek basically argue that, really there's no middle ground. That what might seem like the middle ground of social democracy, what the European countries are in fact doing after World War II, that this is going to put you on the road to serfdom. But then it gets worse. So, okay, even there, I mean, how many people here have read The Road to Serfdom? Anybody? A few, a handful? Okay. Oh, okay, great. Okay, good. So, I mean, this is a book that is touted massively in right-wing American circles. If you ever listen to Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Paul Ryan claims to have read it. Michelle Bachmann claims to have read it. I find that hard to believe, but but it's touted constantly by the extreme right wing of the United States. But whether they've actually read it or not is an interesting question. But one thing we do know is that what Ronald Reagan read wasn't the original book. It was the Reader's Digest condensed version. So the businessmen who brought Hayek to America were very excited by his message, but they thought it was too highbrow for an American audience. But also that Hayek, it's actually a pretty sophisticated book. It's a pretty thoughtful book, and he actually allows for a number of exceptions. And what's really interesting about his book is that actually there are a lot of exceptions. So some of the exceptions that he talks about are pollution, deforestation, sanitary working conditions, the need for social security. So he actually allows for a rather wide space for government action, and he even says you shouldn't argue, against government action in the marketplace per se. What you need to do is figure out what are your criteria for when it's appropriate for the government to be involved and when it's not, which sounds pretty good to me. So they produce a Reader's Digest condensed version where they strip out all of the caveats, all of the exceptions, all of the places where Hayek says, well, actually, you actually kind of do need government. They publish that in Reader's Digest, and then, as if that's not lowbrow enough, no offense to anyone here who grew up reading Reader's Digest, they publish a literal cartoon version, literal cartoons. So The Road to Serfdom in cartoons, 18 boxes with a caption, and it begins with government mobilization of the economy for World War II, and it ends with a firing squad shooting the dissenters. And then my favorite part of the book is that, as if that was not enough, so we've now already created this false dichotomy, right? Extreme, Soviet-style planning or unregulated markets. They do the same thing to Adam Smith. So George Stigler at the University of Chicago, who, by the way, little known fact, or maybe known to this audience, but was the Walgreen professor. I always wonder if he liked that or not, It's like, do you imagine being the CVS professor? I don't know. Anyway, maybe it's okay. But anyway, he was the Walgreen professor at the university, and he was part of a project called the Free Market Project, which maybe some people here know about, but that was wholly funded by a group of libertarian business people, including a fellow named Jasper Crane, who had been an executive at DuPont. As part of the work that Stigler did, he produced an edited version of Adam Smith. Now again, maybe some people in this room know it, but in my experience talking about this, most people do not know that Adam Smith had a very extensive discussion in The Wealth of Nations on the need for banking regulation. So 1776, he's talking about why you cannot have a successful capitalist economy unless you regulate banks, for all the reasons that we know today. This is completely removed from the Stigler version. And there's a discussion in The Wealth of Nations of why workers have to be paid a fair wages, why it's reasonable for workers to unionize, although he doesn't use that word, but he talks about collective agency, how factory owners will pay starvation wages if they can get away with it. I mean, incredible number of things. Oh, and about why governments need to have taxes. All kinds of things that you might not think that Adam Smith would have ever written about if you only ever, heard him talked about by, well, people near here. All of that is removed from the Chicago School version of The Wealth of Nations.
So really, painting that like this or that, and that's the only.
And I think that culminates years later when Margaret Thatcher is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We know that Thatcher was very influenced by Hayek, and she may have actually read him because she actually read. But her famous phrase, Tina, there is no alternative, right? That was one of her slogans. And I just think that that kind of encapsulates this whole argument, right? The idea that there's no alternative, that it's either communist dictatorship or unregulated capitalism. Whereas the reality, as you suggested and as we argue in the book, is no, there's lots of alternatives. And even if we look at the history of capitalism, it's changed a lot since Adam Smith, right? The sort of capitalism of small shop owners that Adam Smith imagined was very different from the managerial and monopolistic capitalism that developed in the 19th century, which was quite different from, the manufacturing-based capitalism of mid-20th century America, which is extremely different from the financialized global capitalism of today. So capitalism has never been one thing. So I think that creates a space for us to talk about, well, what kind of capitalism do we want, and what is the right balance then between private sector and public goods?
And I guess like kind of on that point of as we think about what kind of capitalism we want and where we want to be heading.
Or something else, right?
Or something else.
Right.
Yeah, what future we want.
Right.
I get curious on your thoughts on, since businesses have been so responsible for creating the narrative that we are in today of this kind of free market fundamentalism, do you think that business can be a part in creating a new narrative, or does that need to be coming from government, from Gen Z, who is
question. I mean, I would like to think that business could be part of a new narrative, and I would like to think that there are progressive business people who recognize that what we've done in this country is not good, and that it's actually not good for our country to have massive, the kind of extreme degrees of income inequality that we have, or to have a situation where people have become so distrustful of government that they refuse a vaccine that could save their lives. And I'd like to think that the business community also recognizes, especially after the pandemic, that the economy is people, right? Without people, without workers, without healthy people who can go to work and want to go to work, and are willing to work hard, I mean, the economy doesn't work. So I'd like to think that there are progressive business leaders who believe that and are interested in having a bigger conversation about how we can make our system, more democratic, more fair, and have rules that work, especially in banking. I haven't met those people yet.
This room, maybe?
Exactly, maybe some of them are here, which is one reason. Anat mentioned how we first met at the World Economic Forum in Davos. There are people at Davos who say they're interested in this conversation. It's not exactly clear if they really mean it, and maybe they do. I hope they do, because it would certainly be a whole lot easier to move things forward if we did have enlightened business people who were willing to be part of this conversation.
And maybe bring that to a very real example that Stanford is working through right now, is with the Door School. And so I know that you recently...
I knew we had to get there.
It was going to come up. But you recently declined an invite to speak at the opening of the new Door School of Sustainability because of some of the questions of businesses' influence, particularly the fossil fuel industry's influence on their agenda. And I think reading the book, it just reminded me so much of what how business at the time engaged with folks like Hayek and Friedman at the Chicago School. Curious if you could talk a little bit more about what was behind your decision to decline the invitation and how you see kind of businesses engaging in academia, and if you see any positives there in kind of.
Well, look, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but what we know about the fossil fuel industry and the Door School has said explicitly that it not only will accept funding from the fossil fuel industry, but that it welcomes that funding and that it welcomes partnership. And that's deeply problematic because they're essentially saying that they want to solve the climate crisis in partnership with the people who created that crisis. And to me, that would be like saying we want to solve public health in cooperation with the tobacco industry. And no one in public health would think that that was reasonable. I mean, in fact, if you read the UN Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is extremely instructive for anyone who's interested in climate change, explicitly says that the tobacco industry cannot be a partner in this space because they have proven themselves to be unreliable through their own history of disinformation and dishonest practices. And we know, Eric Conway and I have shown in our work, and others have followed up and reinforced it, the fossil fuel industry has for 30 years now fomented disinformation about climate science. They have lied about their own activities. They claim they're Paris aligned, but if you look at what they're actually doing, their own business models would completely blow the carbon budget. They have attacked climate scientists, including scientists who work in this university. They have misrepresented climate findings. They have cherry-picked data. I mean, they have done so many things that prove that they are not, in fact, a reliable and trustworthy partner. And so if they come along today and say, oh, we want to help fix this, we want to be part of the solution, well, that's all very well and good to say that. But if we actually look at their actions, what we see is that they are continuing to perpetuate the climate crisis. And all of the business models of the major oil and gas companies show their commitment not just to using the oil and gas reserves that they already have, which is serious enough in terms of the carbon budget, but to continue to explore for new oil and gas reserves. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't understand because, if you never took a geology class, you might not know anything about how oil and gas works. But I used to be an exploration geologist, and many of my best friends went to work for the oil and gas industry. I went into mining. But a typical oil and gas field, it takes at least 10 years to develop and prove out. And then once you start pumping oil and gas, you're hoping that that oil and gas field will last for at least 30 years, probably 50 and maybe more. So think about that. The IPCC has said we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. That's 7 years from now. And these folks are developing oil and gas fields that they expect to still be producing oil and gas in 2050, 2075, maybe even 2100. That is just not compatible with any of the conclusions that have come out of the scientific community about how we avoid climate crisis. So, I don't know if it's wishful thinking. I don't know if it's corruption. I don't know if people have been bought. I don't want to make assertions that I can't prove or demonstrate. But what I can prove is the fossil fuel industry is continuing to produce a product that is continuing to perpetuate the climate crisis. And that's the opposite of sustainability.
Yes, fully agreed with that. This is my last question, and then I'm going to open it up, so y'all get ready. But I think hearing that, I'm excited that you were willing to come to the GSB. Curious, why did you agree to speak with us here tonight, and kind of what are you seeing in the kind of the business school realm?
Because Anat invited me, and I like Anat's work, and I wanted to have the chance to talk to her more because, like me, she believes that we need rules, that markets need rules, that governance needs rules, and that, one of the conversations I would like to try to trigger is, I think, is that rules are good, that we need rules, and rules are not anti-competition. We've been talking about this today. A lot of people seem to be operating on the idea that if we have, rules regulating banking or regulating the pharmaceutical industry, that this somehow gets in the way of these markets operating. But and that it somehow impedes competition. But that's ridiculous. Think about football. Football is an incredibly competitive sport, but you have rules. Without rules, there's no game. Right? And you want those rules to be enforced. Or if you think about the Olympics, think about ice skating or, the half pipe. You have rules against doping. If those rules aren't enforced, then the sport isn't fair, and then the whole thing gets undermined, right? So, and the same with regulation. One of the points we tried to make at the end of the book, and we really struggled with this. We really struggled about, the word regulation is a flashpoint for a lot of people, right? There are a lot of people in the business community who will tell you they hate regulation. And so one strategy is to avoid the word because it's a flashpoint word and to say, oh, no, I'm not talking about regulation. I'm just talking about the rules of the road, like, speed limits and stop signs, right? But the other approach, and this is what we decided to do, and it might be wrong, I don't know, but is to actually confront it and say, well, wait a second. Why do we think regulation is bad? Because if you think about it, in biology, we have the concept of biological regulation. Right? That organisms have to regulate their own internal chemistry. If they're warm-blooded, they have to regulate their own internal temperature. And without that, organisms die. Regulation is essential for life. So actually, in biology, regulation is a good thing, right? And maybe in banking, regulation would be a good thing. In fact, that's what Adam Smith argued, because you need regulations to prevent the self-interest of bankers from wrecking the whole economy, right? And the same, I would say, with markets in general, or, business practices, right? If we regulate pollution, that makes the world safer for everyone, right? And what we believe needs regulating changes with time. There was a time when it was legal to dump toxic chemicals into rivers behind factories. And now it's not legal anymore because we decided that wasn't okay. So we developed regulations to deal with it. And that's how I think about carbon pollution. I think there will be a time not too far in the future, this is my optimistic spin, where we'll look back on carbon pollution and we'll think, wow, people were allowed to dump carbon in the atmosphere the same way they dump toxic chemicals in rivers. Like, wow, how is that ever okay, right? So I think regulation is a good thing. I think we should embrace it. I think we shouldn't be ashamed, because I feel like a lot of liberals and progressives, they're kind of apologetic about regulation. They're like, yeah, I know regulation's bad, but we kind of need it. And no, I actually think regulation is good. It's what makes systems work when you have the right regulations. So I forgot the question, coming back to why I came here. So yeah, I'm sure the business school takes money from companies I don't like. I'm sure that's true, but this is not a school of sustainability. I mean, I have a specific issue around a school of sustainability being funded by the people who are threatening the sustainability, not just the climate, but frankly of biodiversity and a whole lot of other things. And so that's just a circle that I can't square.
Yeah, I agree with you on the regulation, and I think it really both good and also can spur so much innovation when you have rules. You need to figure out how to, what new business models can you do that?
And we made that argument back in Merchants of Doubt. You know, people always say necessity is the mother of invention. Regulation is a very powerful form of necessity. And when California started regulating tailpipe emissions, all kinds of technological innovations developed. And in fact, in the history of business in America, I mean, I'm not a business historian, but I know something about this aspect of it. You know, there's a pretty consistent pattern when government regulators say, we need you to do something. We want you to put seatbelts in cars. We want you to put scrubbers on coal-fired power plants. We want you to put airbags in cars. Almost invariably, the industry says, no, we can't afford it. It's too expensive. We'll be bankrupted. The consumer will never accept, you know, the raise in price. And then they do it, and we all get used to it, and it's fine. And nobody ever now doesn't buy a car because it's too expensive because it has airbags, right?
Okay, want to get some audience questions, including from anyone on Zoom. Let me know, Mira. Yes, in the back.
Sure. Hi, Naomi. I wonder, just to pursue the line about regulation for another minute or two, it seems to me that often what business people are most concerned about is not regulation per se, but the creep of regulation. So we go from, you know, we shouldn't pollute the environment to the 2,000-page environmental impact report that takes 5 years to write. And that's kind of the core of the concern. So I'm just curious how you think about that.
To me, one of the tragedies of our current situation is I do think that there are a lot of regulations in this country that probably could be streamlined, but the problem now is that, and I'm going to use the word Republican because it's the appropriate word in this case, when Republicans say we should streamline these regulations, Democrats and environmentalists don't trust them to have a good faith conversation about that because of the history of dishonesty and disinformation in this space. So I would be in favor if you could come up with some kind of bipartisan commission that both sides would agree to that would look at this question. I live in Massachusetts now, which frankly is a nanny state. And I have to say, the one really good thing about moving from California to Massachusetts, and it wasn't the weather, it was actually living in Massachusetts and having the experience of saying, oh, okay, some things really are overregulated, And when we installed the solar panels on our roof, oh my God, I mean, there was like 20 pages of paperwork we had to fill out. It shouldn't be that hard, right? We should be able to find ways to make compliance easier. So I do agree with you on that. And that actually would be a good project for a business school actually to take on, right? Like how could you streamline these things in ways that protect the goal of the regulation, but do make it less onerous for businesses, consumers, people, whatever.
To speak to another issue around regulation, oftentimes business could actually be in favor of it because of the problems of regulatory capture, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, especially since you brought up George Stigler earlier in the conversation and everything. How can we think about implementing regulations that are actually helpful to consumers and society without then the risk of it being just sort of taken over and actually becoming more profitable and more protective of business?
Yeah, I don't know of an example of regulatory capture that became more profitable for business, although if you know an example, I'd be interested. But certainly, yeah. Oh, protectionism, yeah, okay. I guess, yeah.
I guess my studies are usually on electricity industry regulations, so I think that's where a lot of my concerns come in with the energy transition, how we can implement regulations that don't end up just protecting profits for private utilities.
For the incumbents, yeah, that's a good point. Well, of course, electricity being a natural monopoly raises some questions that are different from, say, other kinds of issues. But no, it's an important point. And, Stigler wasn't wrong about regulatory capture, but he was wrong to argue that therefore we shouldn't bother with it, right? I mean, that's not the right answer, right? So I think you're right. And so there are a whole set of important issues about how we make regulatory systems effective and how we keep them independent and autonomous, right? Because we certainly see in the utility space a lot of cronyism, right? And that's a big problem. So I'm not an expert on it. I don't know what the solution is, but if you're working on it, I'd love to learn more about your work.
From the Zoom audience. One is following up on this conversation around regulation, and it's really to answer to the solution piece, like how do we think we can set up regulatory agencies to ensure they're not overly influenced by the industries they're regulating? And I think on that same note, another question around, how has this free market fundamentalism continued to influence other institutions like the court system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the first question seems a lot like the second, so maybe I'll just say one thing about that. I mean, this gets back to the question of opening up the conversation. So this is a work of history, it's not a work of policy, and our goal was not to say what all the solutions to these problems were, but to show how this narrative had been constructed that to make us skeptical of government solutions, to make us skeptical of regulations, and really to deny the many examples of successful government programs like, for example, Social Security or the laws that have protected children against labor in this country. So we have a lot of success stories in the United States. And I gave a talk the other day where someone who was clearly sympathetic said, well, how can we defend the government when most government programs have been failures? And I was like, well, the very fact that you're saying that to me proves the importance of this book, because most government programs actually haven't been failures, first of all. We have lots of examples, especially in the technology space. But also, I mean, lots of businesses fail routinely, but we don't take that as a general indictment of capitalism. We don't say, oh, that business failed, capitalism doesn't work. So the point is to have a better conversation. But I think one can imagine some solutions, like, for example, maybe the utility regulators should have citizens' representatives. Maybe they should be elected. I don't know. I mean, elections can have their own problems too. But in Europe, there's a lot more citizen engagement. In Germany, workers sit on boards of corporations, right? Okay, and that's saying, so I don't know if that really works. But the point is one could at least have a conversation about who else could be in this conversation. And certainly, in Europe, and I'm not saying that there aren't problems with European regulation as well, but they have much stricter rules about regulating pesticides and consumer products. And there are many chemicals that are legal in the United States that are not legal in Europe. And some of them are endocrine disrupting chemicals that I've done research on, where I feel pretty confident that those chemicals are pretty darn bad, and the Europeans have done a better job than we have on those issues.
I'd like you to speculate about how the paradigm of neoliberalism might disappear. Your predecessor, by a number of years in history of science, Thomas Kuhn, who had a very interesting theory that we live within an existing paradigm, and we try to adjust every new phenomenon to it. And at some point, it just won't work, and it breaks.
Yeah.
Right. So neoliberalism probably came into being because classic liberalism, where there wasn't even an umpire of the market, was not working. Mm-hmm. So we've seen all sorts of phenomena right now, like catastrophic climate change, like huge wealth inequalities, which you might think are challenging for the neoliberal paradigm, and some new and ESG, including ESG on the right. There's a conservative ESG.
Yes. Yeah.
But neoliberalism seems to be thriving in the midst of all of those challenges. Can you imagine the paradigm disappearing, and how?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because in my field, Thomas Kuhn is considered very overused and overexposed, so we tend to not talk about him all that much, although I still teach him because I see him as foundational to the field. But the whole notion of a paradigm shift gets to be almost like a cliche for us. But I think that actually you're onto something here, because in a way that is what we need, right? That the dominant paradigm for the last 40 years or so has been neoliberalism, and maybe it's time to start talking about post-liberalism or something. I don't know, maybe part of the new narrative is coming up with a new term, or some kind of more inclusive liberalism, or, I mean, we did think about having a chapter in the book where we would talk about, in a way, answering this question. We decided it was too hard. So but maybe it's the next book. But I was playing with what I wanted to call true cost capitalism, because the way I view it is all of these, well, not all these big problems, but many of these big problems that we're looking at, things that that Eric Conway and I have written, like the health costs of tobacco, the climate crisis, the ozone hole, these are all market failures. That capitalism as operating, people are selling legal products that are threatening the future of life on Earth, or threatening the lives of millions of people every day. So these are massive market failures. And so in Merchants of Doubt, we argue that one of the big motivations for climate change denial was the unwillingness to actually acknowledge these giant failures of capitalism. Because once you acknowledge them, you have to acknowledge that the existing paradigm isn't working, right? And this is actually, in a way, is consistent with Kuhn's argument, right? His argument is, in the beginning, when the anomalies begin to show up, people don't just say, oh, time for a new paradigm. They dig in, right? And they work really, really hard to save the phenomena, right? And we know that that's true. We have lots of examples from history of science. So people cling to the old paradigm until eventually it gets to a breaking point where it's no longer workable. And then that does open the space for a new paradigm to enter. And so I guess what I'm taking out of your question is the suggestion that we are in that moment, and that it is the moment then to start suggesting some new alternatives, to do two things. First, to focus on the anomalies, to remind people of how bad the climate crisis is, which I think is important, because ExxonMobil would like us to think it's not that big a deal, and we'll solve it with carbon capture, and it'll all be fine, right? Or how serious income inequality is. And then to use that to have a conversation about the alternatives. So now you're emboldening me to take a chance at this.
COVID and the Ukraine crisis. And then I was reading a study the other day, I think Axios, a survey that they did, found that over half of Gen Z would identify as anti-capitalists.
Yes, I know, which is kind of amazing, actually. And I've noticed that in my students, too. 10 years ago, when I would teach these materials, I found a lot of my students were pretty skeptical and did wonder if I was a communist. And this is also in San Diego, which, at the time was still somewhat conservative. Now I have my students criticizing me that I'm not radical enough. And I thought, wow, this is like really good when your students start thinking you're an old fogey who's not radical enough, right? Yeah. So I think you're right. I do think there's a generation of people who have come up with the climate crisis and see the way their own future is being threatened by capitalism as we know it, and are looking for some new answers. So maybe it is time to write that next book. Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, sort of going off your discussion of funder influence and your work in Merchants of Doubt and elsewhere, obviously it's not just fossil fuel companies funding climate research, right? Tobacco, public health. I mean, like even niche like beryllium and industry funding beryllium, like it goes on and on, right?
Yeah.
But also, it's not necessarily simple just to say, okay, let's let the government fund everything, as your work showed. I mean, the government has its own priorities, the military has its own priorities.
Right.
What are, just to broaden people's horizons and give people more of a sense of possibility, in your mind, what are some funding schemes that allow for research to be funded by someone that would, reduce or eliminate some of these biases and influences and harms that come with a funder with a very specific agenda for a product?
I think I'd say two things. First of all, I do think that government funding of universities is extremely important. And I do think that, particularly because the government isn't one thing, right? We have lots of different government agencies that fund lots of different kinds of science. So in Science on a Mission, I was looking at very specifically at the role of one federal funder, the US Navy, and the impacts that had on one science, oceanography. But meanwhile, the Army, the Air Force, the Department of Agriculture, the USGS, the Bureau of Reclamation, I mean, lots and lots of government agencies were funding lots and lots of science, including the Fish and Wildlife Service that funded most of the research that Rachel Carson wrote about in Silent Spring. So I do think that government funding of science is incredibly important. And one thing that's been sad for me to watch in the course of my academic career is how, as state funding for public universities has declined and declined and declined, the private universities have not stood by the public universities. I mean, and I think this is a big indictment of Stanford, of Harvard, of Yale, Princeton. With few exceptions, the private universities have not stepped up to the plate and said, public funding of universities is crucial to the future of this democracy. It's crucial to the success and the health of the scientific enterprise. And I think, and even at public universities, I mean, I witnessed many times when the administrators of public universities, I mean, I don't want to be too harsh here. They certainly went to bat in Sacramento, you know, for the University of California, but there were a lot of times when people would stand up in public and say, oh, it's fine, don't worry that the state support for our university has gone from 35% to 13%. We'll make up the difference with private support. And it doesn't really work that way because the private support is different than the public support. And it comes with more strings attached. And it is often, you know, when and look, I loved UCSD. It's a great school, and I'm very loyal to it. But in the years I was there, I watched how we developed an incredible cancer center, and that was good for people who have cancer. An incredible music building, which was good for people who liked music. But whole other areas of the university were atrophying. And there didn't seem to be any mechanism for kind of balancing that. And so one thing some of us talked about earlier today, I mean, one way to think about it would be some kind of internal tax, or maybe internal overhead would be a better term. Actually, no, overhead might be worse. Most faculty hate overhead. But, you know, but some kind of internal system where when you bring in money from the private sector, you say, okay, that's fine, but 20% of this is going to go into a pool where other parts of the university could compete for this. And then that's the other part is, and this is a part that troubles me a lot about, a lot of private funding. And I've seen a lot of this up close and personal at Harvard. A huge amount of private funding comes into Harvard, and I'm going to assume it's the same here, but I don't know for sure, with no peer review. You know, some wealthy donor says, I'd like to fund a project on X, and there's no peer review, there's no external evaluation. And I mean, that violates some of the most basic principles, you know, that have been instantiated in, let's say, the NSF since, you know, the end of World War II. And the potential then for, well, I am going to use the word distortion. Distortion is a tricky word for a historian to use because it implies that there's some undistorted version of the thing, which, you know, is kind of an ahistorical way of thinking. But yet, and this is, you know, I write about this at length in Merchants of Doubt, in Science and Admission, because there was this giant debate that took place back in the 80s in our field, in history of science, about this notion of distortion and whether it even made sense to talk about distortion. And most historians sided with the argument that it didn't make sense because it implied a kind of undistorted path that was very ahistorical. But in my work on Science and Admission, I found the scientists complaining about distortion. A group of very prominent scientists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution complained that the Navy agenda was distorting the agenda of oceanography as a science. So I think there is a way in which we can think about distortion in terms of the breadth and the diversity of the scientific research that we would like to see happen. And what often happens when you rely too much on a particular funder is that the research gets narrowed. And that's the whole argument that I make in Science and Admission. It's not that the research that was done was bad research or that it was wrong or false. It wasn't false, but a whole lot of other things got abandoned, left behind, crowded out, or questions that never even got asked. Because, and again, Paul's work on this is so important, right? That if you know your patron won't be interested in a particular thing, you're not even going to bother to suggest it, right?
I was wondering how you situate the work of Eleanor Ostrom when you think of potential futures, cooperative economics.
Yeah.
Does it come up? You know, how do you see it?
So interesting that you asked about that for two reasons. Many years ago, I wanted to write a paper attacking Garrett Hardin and attacking all of the idiot scientists who quote him without ever having read that paper. And you know they haven't read it because if they read it, they wouldn't be quoting it, right? Because first of all, it's an incredibly racist piece of work. And second of all, the guy was a biologist who clearly knew nothing about the actual history of commons or any of the things that any historian could tell you about why the Enclosure Acts were passed. The Enclosure Acts were not passed because the commons were being overrun in a tragedy of self-interest. No, they were enclosed because wealthy, powerful people wanted them for their own purposes. So, I mean, that's one of the single most damaging papers ever to have been published in Science magazine. And I think all scientists should ban the language of the tragedy of the commons from their vocabulary, because it's just wrong, right? And Eleanor Ostrom is the person who has, I think, most famously demonstrated that. And when I first learned about her work, I was like, oh, good, I don't have to write the tirade against Garrett Hart. I never really wrote it because I could never calm myself down enough to write it in a way that I thought would be effective. So sometimes I just have to take a deep breath, But also, it's really weird because I gave an interview just a couple of days ago where it was on the radio, and the guy said, I used ChatGPT to get questions about your new book. And I was like, okay, we'll see how that. And so he starts with the first question, and it's a perfectly fine question, and then we move on to other stuff. And afterwards I said, well, could you send me the list of questions? Because he didn't end up he had like 10 questions, he only used one. They were all about Eleanor Ostrom's work. ChatGPT had confused me with Eleanor Ostrom. So maybe there's something good there.
At least it didn't give him an obituary.
Yeah, that would be bad. Does that happen to some people?
John Markoff?
Is that right? They think he's dead?
Yeah.
Whoa. Wow, that's crazy. That reminds me of a colleague of mine who discovered something famous when he was young that was named after him, and he described going to a conference, meeting a graduate student who said, oh, I thought you were dead.
Because if there is one message that you want this room full of students and current leaders and future leaders to take away from this 120-year history that you've been looking into, what's the final?
Well, I think it's the anti-Tina message. It's to say that Margaret Thatcher was wrong, that there are alternatives, and the reason why it may sometimes feel to us as if there aren't alternatives is because that's the story that we've been told, and we've been frankly bombarded with it, because we didn't talk a lot about the films or the movies or the Little House on the Prairie, but I mean, part of what we show in the book is the saturation of this message that there are no alternatives, when in fact, there are all kinds of alternatives, and some of them might work better for us than the one we have right now.
For all of us to go out and figure out what all those alternatives are.
Me too. I'm excited for you to do that work too.
Please join me
in
in thanking
emphasis
Naomi.
on the you.